In 1917, a young Salvation Army volunteer climbed into a shell crater somewhere in the mud of northern France and fried donuts for American soldiers using a helmet as a pan and an oil drum as a stove. The soldiers had been living in trenches for weeks. They were cold, exhausted, and eating military rations that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. And then this woman handed them something warm, sweet, and round, something that smelled like home and tasted like the world had not completely fallen apart. Word spread through the trenches faster than any military order. Soldiers were lining up for blocks. Some of them wept. That was World War I. By 2023, Americans alone were consuming over 10 billion donuts every single year. Dunkin had over 13,000 locations across 42 countries. Krispy Kreme was publicly traded on the Nasdaq with a market valuation in the billions. In Japan, donut shops had waiting lines that stretched around city blocks. In South Korea, they were sold in subway stations as commuter breakfast. In India, they were being marketed as luxury goods in upscale malls. This is the history of the donut. And it is far stranger, far older, and far more deeply woven into the fabric of human civilization than you would ever expect from something you grab with your morning coffee. Nobody invented the donut on a specific day in a specific kitchen. That is the first thing you need to understand. The donut did not arrive fully formed from the mind of some genius baker in 19th century New England. What happened was something more interesting and more complicated. Humans across dozens of cultures and thousands of years kept arriving at the same basic idea independently, because the idea was so obvious and so satisfying that it was almost inevitable. Fry dough and fat. Add something sweet. Eat it. That is the entire blueprint. And it appears in ancient Rome, where street vendors sold a fried pastry called scribletta. It appears. In 1917, a young Salvation Army volunteer climbed into a shell crater somewhere in the mud of northern France and fried donuts for American soldiers using a helmet as a pan and an oil drum as a stove. The soldiers had been living in trenches for weeks. They were cold, exhausted, and eating military rations that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret. And then this woman handed them something warm, sweet, and round, something that smelled like home and tasted like the world had not completely fallen apart. Word spread through the trenches faster than any military order. Soldiers were lining up for blocks. Some of them wept. That was World War I. By 2023, Americans alone were consuming over 10 billion donuts every single year. Dunkin had over 13,000 locations across 42 countries. Krispy Kreme was publicly traded on the Nasdaq with a market valuation in the billions. In Japan, donut shops had waiting lines that stretched around city blocks. In South Korea, they were sold in subway stations as commuter breakfast. In India, they were being marketed as luxury goods in upscale malls. This is the history of the donut. And it is far stranger, far older, and far more deeply woven into the fabric of human civilization than you would ever expect from something you grab with your morning coffee. In medieval Arabia, where a dish called lukamat, small fried dough balls drenched in honey, was documented in 13th century cookbooks and is still eaten across the Middle East today. It appears in ancient China, where a fried dough strip called yotiao has been eaten for breakfast for over 1,000 years. It appears in West Africa, where a fried dough fritter called puff puff predates European contact and is still a staple food across Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon. Every culture that had access to grain, fat, and fire eventually arrived at some version of fried dough. Because it works. It is cheap, it is fast, it requires almost no equipment, and the result is something that human brains are biologically wired to find deeply pleasurable. The combination of fat, sugar, and carbohydrate triggers dopamine responses that are not entirely different from what other addictive substances do. Food scientists have studied this. The donut is not an accident. It is a precision instrument aimed directly at the reward centers of the human brain. But here is where the story gets specific and where the thing we actually call a donut begins to take shape. In the 17th century, Dutch settlers arrived in what would become New York. They brought with them a traditional fried dough pastry called oliebollen, which translates directly as oil balls. They were dense, round, fried in lard, and sometimes filled with raisins or apple. They were not yet the light, ring-shaped, glazed object sitting in a pink box on your counter. But they were close. They were the direct ancestor. The Dutch planted those oliebollen into the food culture of colonial America, and the recipe began to evolve. American bakers experimented with different fats, different doughs, different sweeteners. The pastry got lighter. It got sweeter. And it picked up a new name somewhere along the way. Dough. Nuts. Because the early versions were often small, round, and knotted, or occasionally filled with a walnut or hazelnut at the center to ensure the middle cooked through properly. But there was still a problem. And the problem was physics. When you fry a ball of dough, the outside cooks fast and the inside cooks slow. Too much heat and you get a burnt exterior with a raw, doughy center. Not enough heat and you get a greasy, undercooked lump. Early doughnuts were inconsistent. Some were perfect. Many were not. And the solution to that problem is the detail that changed everything. Enter Hanson Gregory. In 1847, Gregory was a 16-year-old sailor from Camden, Maine. The story goes that he was aboard a lime trading vessel in the North Atlantic, eating a fried dough cake his mother had packed for the voyage, and he found himself frustrated by the undercooked center. So he punched a hole through the middle with the ship's tin pepper box and fried it again. The hole meant the dough cooked evenly all the way through. No raw center. No burnt exterior. Just consistent, perfectly fried dough from edge to edge. Now, whether that story is entirely true is debatable. There is a competing theory that the hole was invented by Gregory's mother, Elizabeth Gregory, who used the ring shape as a deliberate design choice. There is another theory that the hole was independently developed by multiple bakers across New England around the same time. There is yet another theory that the ring shape came to America through contact with indigenous fry bread traditions. What is not debatable is this. The ring-shaped donut spread across America in the second half of the 19th century with a speed that suggested it had solved something people did not even know was a problem. It was easier to fry. It was easier to handle. It could be stacked on a stick or a dowel for display and transport. It cooled faster. It fit better in the hand. The hole was not a gimmick. The hole was an engineering solution. And it turned the donut from a regional curiosity into a scalable product. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived. And it brought the donut machine. In 1920, a Russian immigrant named Adolf Levitt was running a bakery in New York City. He was watching the lines of customers waiting for his fried donuts and thinking about the problem of speed. Each donut was still being made by hand. Shaped by hand, dropped into oil by hand, turned by hand, pulled out by hand. The process was slow, inconsistent, and labor-intensive. So Levitt built a machine. The wonderful almost human automatic donut machine, as it was actually called, could produce donuts at a rate that no human teen could match. It shaped the dough automatically, dropped it into precisely temperature-controlled oil, turned it at exactly the right moment, and delivered finished donuts onto a conveyor belt in a continuous stream. Levitt put the machine in the window of his bakery. People stopped on the sidewalk to watch it. They had never seen anything automated produce food in real time before. The machine was the spectacle. The donut was the souvenir. Levitt's sales exploded. He began manufacturing and selling the machines to other bakeries. By 1931, he was reportedly earning $25 million a year from machine sales alone. The donut had crossed from artisanal craft into industrial production. And once it crossed that line, there was no going back. Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. The donut might have remained a popular but regional American pastry, one of dozens of fried dough traditions competing for space in a crowded food culture. It might have stayed in bakery windows in county fairs and church fundraisers and never become the global cultural object it is today. What turned it into something else entirely was a war. When the United States entered World War I, the Salvation Army deployed female volunteers to France to support American troops. These women, who became known as donut lassies or donut girls, operated out of makeshift huts near the front lines. They cooked, they cleaned, they wrote letters home for illiterate soldiers, and they made food. The most famous food they made was donuts. The conditions were extraordinary. They had no proper kitchens, no industrial equipment, no reliable supply chains. They fried donuts in helmets, in shell craters, in converted oil drums, sometimes under artillery fire. They made them by hand, thousands per day, and distributed them to soldiers who had been surviving on military rations for months. For those soldiers, the donut was not just food. It was a psychological lifeline. It tasted like home. It tasted like their mother's kitchen or the bakery on the corner of their street or the church social they had attended before the war. In the middle of industrialized slaughter on a scale the world had never seen, a warm fried donut was a piece of evidence that ordinary life still existed somewhere. The soldiers came home. And they brought the craving with them. The donut lassies and their story became one of the most widely reported human interest narratives of the entire war.
American newspapers ran photographs. Magazines ran profiles. The Salvation Army's profile in the United States rose dramatically on the strength of donut-related goodwill.
And an entire generation of American men returned from Europe with a specific, emotionally loaded relationship to a specific fried pastry.
Donut sales in America surged through the 1920s. Automated donut machines proliferated. Bakeries expanded. And then a man named Vernon Rudolph did something that transformed the landscape permanently.
In 1937, Rudolph bought a secret yeast donut recipe from a New Orleans chef, drove to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and set up a donut shop. He initially planned to sell only to grocery stores. But on his first day of operation, people walking past smelled the donuts frying through a window and knocked on the door asking if they could buy some directly. Rudolph cut a hole in the wall. That shop was the first Krispy Kreme. The recipe was the hot original glazed. And the strategy of letting the smell of hot donuts do the marketing, of making the production process visible from the street, of creating a sensory experience that pulled people through the door before they had consciously decided to enter, was so effective that it became the foundational template for an entire industry. Smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion. Food scientists call it the olfactory hook. Krispy Kreme did not advertise the taste of their donuts. They advertised the smell. They made the donut's production a public spectacle. They turned the window into a theater and the donut into the star. By the 1950s, the donut had become embedded in American culture in a way that went beyond food. It was in police stations, where the stereotype of the donut-eating officer was becoming a cultural shorthand. It was in diners and lunch counters. It was in the emerging car culture, available at drive-thrus and roadside stands. And in 1950, a man named William Rosenberg opened a coffee and donut shop in Quincy, Massachusetts, that he called Dunkin' Donuts. He had noticed that coffee and donuts together accounted for the overwhelming majority of his catering revenue at factory sites. So he built an entire business model around the combination. The insight was not just about the food. It was about the ritual. Coffee and a donut is not a meal. It is a pause. It is a transition between sleeping and working, between the private world of home and the public world of obligation. The donut became the food of that specific liminal moment. The thing you consumed while you were becoming a different version of yourself for the day. And Dunkin' built an empire on that ritual, expanding to 42 countries and fundamentally reshaping the global breakfast market. But the donut's global expansion did not happen uniformly or simply. In Japan, Mr. Doughnut arrived in 1971 and built something that had almost nothing to do with the American model. Japanese Mr. Doughnut stores were not grab-and-go operations. They were sit-down cafes with ceramic cups and table service. The donuts were adapted for Japanese taste preferences, lighter, less sweet, more delicately flavored. New varieties were introduced, including the pan de ring, made from a chewy tapioca-based dough that created a texture completely different from any Western donut. It became the best-selling donut in Japan. A product invented for Japan, by Japan. Within a framework borrowed from America. When Krispy Kreme opened in the United Kingdom in 2003, British customers lined up before dawn. When Dunkin' opened stores in South Korea, local operators introduced donut flavors based on traditional Korean ingredients. In Indonesia, J.Co Donuts launched in 2005 as a homegrown brand that openly borrowed from Krispy Kreme's aesthetic but tailored its products to Southeast Asian preferences and rapidly became one of the largest donut chains in Asia. The donut had become a vehicle. A form that different cultures could fill with their own flavors, their own meanings, their own rituals. The American framework traveled. What went inside it changed. But underneath all of this expansion, a darker current was running. The industrialization of the donut had created something that bore almost no relationship to its ancestors. The oliebollen of colonial Dutch America were dense, made with whole ingredients, fried in natural animal fat, and eaten occasionally. The industrial donut of the 20th and 21st century was a precision-engineered delivery mechanism for refined sugar, bleached flour, and partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, produced by machines, preserved with chemicals, and designed to be consumed daily by people who were not thinking of it as an occasional treat but as a routine breakfast. By the 1990s, public health researchers were beginning to draw connections between the widespread consumption of trans fats, the primary ingredient in the hydrogenated oils used to fry mass-market donuts, and catastrophic rates of cardiovascular disease across the Western world. The FDA eventually moved to ban partially hydrogenated oils in American food production. The ban took full effect in 2020. The donut industry quietly reformulated. New frying oils.
New preservatives. New chemical processes to replicate the taste and texture of what trans fats had provided. The product in the box looked the same. The label changed. The reformulation happened largely without public announcement, because the companies understood that the donut's entire cultural power rested on its association with comfort, pleasure, and uncomplicated enjoyment. The moment it became a site of health anxiety, it risked losing the emotional identity that made it worth buying in the first place. This is the fundamental tension the donut has carried for 100 years. It is sold as comfort and joy. It is produced as industrial chemistry. And the distance between those two things has never been wider than it is right now. And yet the donut is also undergoing the most dramatic culinary reinvention in its history simultaneously. Across major cities on every continent, a new generation of independent donut makers is doing something completely different. They are using locally milled heritage grain flours. They are frying in high-quality animal fats. They are topping their donuts with seasonal fruit compotes, single-origin chocolate ganaches, cultured cream, edible flours, and fermented glazes. They are charging $12, $15, even $20 for a single donut and selling out before noon. These boutique donut operations are not selling a product. They are selling a counter-narrative. The donut as craft object. The donut is evidence that the simplest forms can carry the most complex ideas. They are using the same basic blueprint, fry dough and fat, add something sweet, that humans have been using for 10,000 years, and finding entirely new things to say with it. In Tokyo, there are donut shops with 3-month waiting lists. In London, there are donut bars where the donut is treated with the seriousness of a Michelin-starred dessert course. In Los Angeles, there are donut makers who source their lard from specific heritage breed pig farms and their glaze ingredients from small batch artisan producers. The donut has split. One version is the cheapest, most mass-produced, most chemically engineered food product on the industrial market. The other version is a luxury artisan object made with obsessive attention to ingredient quality and craft technique. Both are called doughnuts. Both descend from the same Dutch oil balls planted in American soil 300 years ago. And somewhere in the enormous middle between those two extremes, 10 billion doughnuts are consumed in America every year by people who are not thinking about ancient Rome or colonial New York or the trenches of World War I or trans fat reformulations or heritage grain flours. They are just eating a donut. Because it is warm. Because it is sweet. Because it smells like something their brain has been trained since childhood to associate with safety and pleasure and the particular comfort of ordinary life continuing as it should. Today, somewhere in a factory outside Chicago, a machine is producing 40,000 donuts per hour. Somewhere in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a Krispy Kreme hot light is flicking on, signaling to everyone within half a mile that the glazed donuts are coming off the line right now. Somewhere in Tokyo, a customer is waiting in line outside a boutique donut shop that only makes 40 donuts a day, each one hand-decorated with seasonal ingredients sourced from a specific prefecture. And somewhere in a kitchen in Lagos or Cairo or Manila, someone is dropping rounds of sweet dough into hot oil because they are having people over, and this is the thing that everyone loves and has always loved. The donut is 10,000 years old and it was invented this morning. It is the cheapest item on the menu and it is a $20 luxury object. It toppled no governments and fed soldiers in shell craters and crossed every ocean and adapted to every culture it encountered. It is a whole surrounded by something sweet. And somehow, that has been enough to conquer the world. If this story changed how you think about something you have eaten 100 times without thinking, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what your favorite donut is and where you first had it. We cover hidden histories like this every week, and the next one is stranger than you expect.